So today we're looking at the parable of Leaven. We're looking at it, what exactly that means. This is interesting. I'm reading a book by Arnold Fruchtenbaum. I'll make references to his points of view on things. And I agree with him, and I'll sort of lay out my argument, exactly what I believe and why. And it's really interesting because he has a view that is totally different to all the other commentaries I've read on this. And I actually agree with him, so I guess I'd be in the minority view. But yeah, it's Matthew chapter 13, verse 33. The parable is one verse long. You can almost completely, skip over it and not think an awful lot to it. I'll provide some context before we read it. So, as we talked about last time, we talked about how Jesus' ministry was to the Jews first. He was giving them their chance to accept him as the Messiah. He then switched in around Matthew 12, and he opened it up to the Gentiles, and he started to preach to Gentiles. So if we actually, before we look at Matthew 13, chapter 3, if we go back and sort of slowly walk through Matthew 12, I'll do like a whistle-stop tour of Matthew 12, mentioning a few things. So, we're looking through Matthew 12, in verse 14, around that sort of area, we sort of, it talks about the Pharisees. Obviously, they're planning to destroy Jesus. They're starting to plot against him, mainly because Jesus is starting to draw large crowds. And they're looking, obviously, to catch him out with various things. Jesus then starts to talk about, in around verse 22, through 31 and 37, about the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit and committing the unpardonable sin. My view, and Arnold's view on this, is that this was a sin that was only available to that generation of Jews at that time. Obviously, they have Jesus in front of them, and it's their rejection of the Messiah there and then, which is the unpardonable sin. It sort of reads here, where exactly am I looking? So, from verse 31 in chapter 12, therefore I say to you, every sin and blasphemy will be forgiven men, but blasphemy against the Spirit will not be forgiven men. Anyone who speaks a word against the Son of Man, it will be forgiven him. But whoever speaks against the Holy Spirit, it will not be forgiven, either in this age or in the age to come. I think very, very recently they'd accused Jesus of being demon-possessed, or having demons, or being on the side of the demons after Jesus cast out the demons. And it was that sin, which I believe is the unpardonable sin, that was, like I say, designated for that generation to come. The rest of the chapter starts to talk about that generation of Pharisees as well, who are, almost preventing the Jewish people coming to the Messiah. And right at the end of chapter 12, we see, the Pharisees start to demand a sign from Jesus. And in verse 39, he responds to them, and he says, but he answered and said to them, an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given for it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And the reference here being, obviously, with Jonah. Jonah was a prophet that went to Nineveh and was actually quite successful. But Jesus is saying here, I've done all these signs in front of you, that's it. I'm not going to do any more signs from there. And that was it really. He then obviously started to turn his attention to the Gentiles from there on out. And when we get to Matthew 13, we get to this concept, which is the idea of Jesus. Now that he's switched his attention to Gentiles, he talks about something which is called the mystery of the kingdom of heaven. We see this in Matthew chapter 13, verse 11. So you see there, he talks about the parable of the sower. He then says to them in verse 11, he answered and said to them, because it has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. So what's understood really, so this is sort of Arnold's theory, and again I buy into this idea. The mystery of the kingdom of heaven is the period or the age between the first coming of Jesus, obviously there at the time, and his second coming. So it's the age we're in now. So we're in what is understood as the mystery of the kingdom of heaven. And In chapter 13, Jesus then goes through a series of parables explaining what the mystery of the kingdom of heaven is like, or what this kingdom is like. And it's called the mystery kingdom due to the Old Testament being revealed in the New Testament. So that's why we understand it's the mystery. And obviously those who cannot see it, they cannot see it. But to us it has been given to understand that as Christians. Obviously, the mystery kingdom, it begins in Matthew 12 with the Jewish rejection of the Messiah and will end with Jesus' coming. And we see this in Matthew. You quickly turn to Matthew 23, verse 37. Just quickly flick there. So Matthew 23, verse 37, which reads, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you are not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So it's talking about the future turning around of the Jews, finally coming around and accepting Jesus. And that is when we see the end of the mystery of the kingdom, and we enter what's understood as the sort of the next age as such. It will start the Messianic age as such. So Matthew 13 is a description, Jesus describing what this period of time will look like, what exactly is happening in there. So you've got like the parable of the wheat and the tares. That's describing what it will be like in the church. So then when we come to Matthew 13:33, just get a read through. And this reads, another parable he spoke to them, the kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal till it was all leavened. So obviously from here we can see 3 what we might understand to be like mysterious components in the parable. So these are 3 sort of metaphors, analogies that we're going to have a look at. We've got the leaven to start with, we've got the woman, and we've got the 3 meals. Okay, so those are the 3 components, and there's a big reason why those 3 components are in there and what it overall means. I might ask some questions. So firstly, what do we understand leaven to mean? What do we know leaven typically in the Bible? What does that mean typically? Yeah, good, sin. Okay. So leaven represents sin. So already this is already looking interesting. So the kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal till it was all leavened. We can see that obviously leaven represents sin if we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 5. So quickly flick to 1 Corinthians chapter 5 for me. So I'll go through what each individual word means, and then I'll go over what exactly I believe the parable is talking about here. So 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6 to 8. And this reads, your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So something really interesting, when I look at my commentary, I use a John MacArthur study Bible, and I don't agree with everything he says, but something that's really interesting is obviously he says that leaven obviously represents evil or represents sin everywhere in the Bible except Matthew 13:33, which I think is quite a common thing for a lot of commentaries to say, which doesn't really make much sense in the context of the Bible, because it's very odd for all of a sudden to be used every single place except for 1 verse, when actually when you read it back in, when you understand it meaning evil in the context, I'll explain obviously later, it makes complete sense that it actually is meaning evil and does mean sin in this instance. So I just thought that was interesting. Obviously that would go against what we understand it to mean in the Bible. So from Corinthians, we understand it here. Obviously, the church must be unleavened. So therefore, we can understand the meaning of Matthew 13:33, that the kingdom of heaven, whatever they're talking about or referring to there, contains some sort of evil, or there is evil in the three parts. So we'll get into the three parts in a minute. But obviously, it contains some sort of evil because there is some leaven in there. And obviously, we know from here, since Jesus has opened up his ministry to the Gentiles, the focus of Matthew 13, I would say, is going to be the church. It's going to be exactly what that means by the church. We'll get into the three parts or exactly what that means. We then have the next part. We then have the woman. So does anyone know what woman typically means? If you see anything to do with a woman, what we associate that with in the Bible? Not all women, but I mean just when we see the term woman. Does anyone know? Have a guess? Yeah. So that's the first thing we typically might think about. So symbolically, so this is my view and Arnold's view, so what he says is, women symbolically in Scripture is a spiritual fornication. So obviously that's like the image we see in Revelation, some sort of spiritual fornication, some sort of adultery or harlotry, something of that nature. We see that in Revelation. So quickly turn to Revelation 2, chapter 20. So there are two places in Revelation. So you see Revelation 2, chapter 20. Verse 20, Revelation 2, not chapter 20, verse 20, thanks. Glad you're paying attention. Just testing you, just test. That's what you say as a teacher, just testing. Yeah. So this talks about the idea of a Jezebel. So Revelation 2:20, this reads, "Nevertheless, I have a few things against you, because you allow that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols." So you can see in Revelation 20, we see the Jezebel, we see the sexual immorality, we see sacrifice to idols. So typically idolatry, harlotry, fornication, these things are associated when you see just the term woman. And that's, I believe, you can read back into Matthew 13:33 in that particular instance. And obviously this is just a woman, obviously, who is influencing the church. And this isn't about an individual woman, it's like an umbrella term for something in the world, and we'll get into what exactly that is. We then have Revelation 17. So again, we've got another example, quite a much more famous example. Revelation chapter 17, verse 1, quite a short chapter. When I was reading this and researching it, I found it really fascinating, but maybe another time I'll go into Revelation 17 because that's a whole rabbit hole in itself. But for now, I'm just going to lightly go over it and obviously say sort of how it's somewhat relevant. So from verse 1, then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot, who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication. The inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So she carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. I saw a woman sitting on the scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, the abominations of the earth. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I marvelled with great amazement. But the angel said to me, Why did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which was the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not, and I will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not and is yet and yet is. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. But there are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition. 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, have received no kingdom as of yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. They are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, and he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. And he said to me, the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind, and to give their kingdom to the beast, until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman who you saw is that great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth. So there's a lot of imagery here, and this is directly, I believe, related to what we're looking at in Matthew 13:33. So firstly, you have obviously the harlotry. Obviously, this is a symbol of idolatry. People being led astray. So obviously, when we look at Revelation, we're looking at what is to come. This is obviously a prophecy in the future. And the harlotry, a symbol of idolatry. From verse 1, that great harlot that sits on many waters. Sitting on many waters, meaning having mass influence over many people. With whom kings of the earth committed fornication, the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So a lot of people are buying into this particular system. And I think it's particularly relevant when we look at Babylon here. You think the obvious thing when we think of Babylon, when we think of this, is something such as the Roman Catholic Church. So you think that's sprung out of Babylon. And we can see in this particular chapter, and this is linked to Matthew 13:33, the influence of the Catholic Church today and potentially in the future. So obviously these include, when we look at verse 2, with whom kings of the earth committed fornication, the inhabitants are drunk on the wine. A lot of people, the biggest religion in the world technically is Christianity, which the majority, we'll say Christianity, those comments like that, the majority of which are Roman Catholic. We see, the persecution of the saints. I believe, in verse 6, you see, I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of martyrs of Jesus. You think what the Catholic Church have done to genuine Christians, over the years, and this, it talks about, like the mother of the harlots and all this idea. And when you think of like the idolatry, and the woman of who's the beast, this is the Catholic Church is in mother and child worship, which comes directly from Babylon, which is where we see this whole the worship of the mother of a woman as such. That is from Babylon, which is now in itself the Catholic Church that we see today. We were talking about earlier, the centre of nativity is Mary and Jesus. That's what is being worshipped there. And I've done, if you want to watch more, I've done a whole Christmas video on this. So, this is all sort of linked there. And, this is heavily linked to Daniel 7. So we look at Daniel 7. This talks about the beast. It talks about the beasts in this chapter as well. So this chapter and Daniel 7 pair really well together. We won't look at Daniel 7, but in Daniel 7, verse 25, it's a similar situation. It's talking about the age to come, and it talks about... Actually, if we will turn there actually quickly. If you go Daniel chapter 7, verse 25, for me very quickly. Yeah, Daniel chapter 7. You're right, what's wrong? 25. Oh, that's why, yeah, there's no 35. So, Daniel 7 is talking about the 4 beasts that are to come, and I'll explain some of those in a minute. But something that's really interesting from Daniel 7:25, again, another reference of what we understood can be the Catholic Church, is it reads, he shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and laws. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. As that gets into the 3.5 years, what we understand, but it's fascinating. It talks about, the intent to change times and laws. So firstly, you've got the persecuting of the saints, again, something the Catholic Church has been doing. We're changing the times and the law. That is actually directly related to things such as the Sabbath, so changing when the actual Sabbath is. Something Chuck Misler has said before. I was only listening to a few days ago. He talks about how, in this particular verse, the Catholic Church has obviously taken over like the branch of Christianity and has started to change customs. I mean, a good example is things like Christmas. That is not something that Christians we should be doing. And it's changed when the Sabbath is. So as a result, we're doing our church and our Sabbath on a Sunday. And that was obviously, we know that was never when the Sabbath was or anything like that. Which is a bit of a side point. But in Daniel 7, talking about the future, makes, I believe, a reference to the Catholic Church. Same with Revelation, chapter 17. But anyway, yeah. So back to Revelation 17. We see, signs of wealth, chapter 4. Again, another thing, the Roman Empire was put back into the Catholic Church, basically, when it collapsed. It's carried on in that. And then something very interesting we see in verse 9. It says, here is the mind which has wisdom, the 7 heads, the 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Obviously, the 7 mountains, Rome was built on 7 hills. I don't know if you know about that story. So the 7 hills on which Rome was built, the Catholic Church being an extension of the Roman Empire. We then have the 5 kingdoms that have fallen, and the other has not yet come. Obviously, the 5 kingdoms in order are going to be Egypt, what's believed to be Egypt, Assyria, and then from Daniel's age, we know Babylon, Persia, Greece, and finally Rome, which is the last one. So obviously, as such yet to come, but obviously we can say we're in that, or that is due to come. And this relates to the 4 beasts in Daniel 7. Remember when he talks about the 4 beasts and the statue? Obviously, Daniel gets into who exactly that is going to be, but that's for another day, another topic. So the reason for this, obviously, the whole point that I've gone into Revelation 17 to talk about the idolatry related to the woman, but also it will give a good indicator of what Matthew 13:33 means, and I'll reveal that in a minute. The final thing we want to look at in Matthew is then the 3 meals, what exactly that means. So to have a look at that, if we could go to Matthew chapter 16 for me. I hope it all makes sense so far. All good? So Matthew chapter 16. So something Arnold said, it was quite interesting. I think I sort of wrestled with this idea, and I sort of looked into myself, and I started understanding what he's talking about. But the idea, when we look at Matthew 16, it's just after Jesus has fed the 4,000, and this is important because he talks about the loaves of bread and talks about the number. And this is really important because Arnold makes the argument that when we see the number associated with, because Jesus talks about the leaven, he sort of says at the end, I'm not talking about bread, I'm talking about the ideas of the Pharisees. He associates that with a number, and the idea being that when you associate that number with the leaven there, it's talking about the number of like false doctrines, or the number that's associated. So obviously we're receiving, I think he talks about the idea, or I sort of read into the idea, that maybe obviously when we're taking the bread, we've got to take, what Jesus talks about taking like his bread as such, not that of the Pharisees and scribes. Maybe it's to combat the amounts of false doctrine that comes from the Pharisees. But we'll give it a read first. So if we have a look at Matthew 16, I'll quickly read through verse 1. Matthew 16, verse 1. And this reads, Then the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and testing him, asked asked that he would show them a sign from heaven. He answered and said to them, "When it is evening, you say, 'It will be fair weather, for the sky is red,' and in the morning, 'It will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening.' Hypocrites, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to it, except the sign of the prophet of Jonah." And he left and departed them. Now when his disciples had come to the other side, they had forgotten to take bread. And Jesus said to them, "Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." And they reasoned among themselves, saying, "It is because we have taken no bread." But Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, "Are you of little faith? Why do you reason among yourselves, because you have brought no bread? Do you not yet understand, or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000, and how many baskets you took up? Nor the 7 loaves of the 4,000, and how many large baskets you took up? How is it you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread, but to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees?" Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees. It's really interesting here. So I believe the point being made by Arnold is to say the number relates to like the amount of error. Obviously, the number of people being fed amounts to like the mirrored equivalent of like the error of the Pharisees. So I think that's an interesting point. Maybe that's something that you can't necessarily see that's obvious. So I think that'd be something interesting to discuss. But putting that all together, so the idea there is obviously you see a number and that's associated with like the number of doctrine, the number of false doctrine. You put that all together and you get the meaning basically. So when we go back to Matthew 13:33, if we quickly pop back there. So Matthew 13:33. We see that it talks about the idea of the kingdom of heaven, the age in which we're going to be in. There's going to be a large number of false doctrine, a large number of sin in 3 parts, okay, designated in 3 parts. And the belief from Arnold, and I actually agree with him on this, is that the idea is that you've got the 3 churches of God who are going to be filled with sin. You've got the Catholic, you've got the Orthodox, you've got the Protestant. It makes it very relevant when you talk about the woman back in Revelation, direct reference to the Catholic Church. You've got to remember all these churches have sprung out of the Catholic Church. It's just started as the Catholic Church. There's always been a remnant, but you think when Constantine took over in the sort of 4th century, the Catholic Church has been the dominant like false doctrine in the world as such. And when we can see here, we talk about the leaven, as I say, the error that's there, and that is not just in Catholic and Orthodox, but is in Protestant as well. And my own thoughts and understanding of this is that their main error that they all have in common, because many of them vary on different traditions, and some are right on some things and some are right on the other. The main error that they all have is ultimately their rejection of Israel and God's chosen people. The reason I believe this is that obviously Catholics and Orthodox, what you call supersessionist, they're quite obviously supersessionist and they're happy to say that. And Protestants, a few facts, 9 out of 10 Protestant churches would reject prophecies for Israel. They would reject that Israel are God's chosen people. Obviously they're going to buy into the idea that God has replaced Israel. But I'll get into some examples in a minute. But I think I'll share something like, I've had a massive burden, I think. I've been praying exactly where to be led with what I'm doing, and I think the big thing that I've been led to do is to talk about Israel and exactly, get into the replacement theology and to really challenge Christians' views on Israel, because you really get into it and the majority of people are most likely replacementists. And I think the reason, I haven't realised actually, but I've been sort of drawn to this topic for several weeks now. And when you look at this, I was led to this sort of passage and this topic, and taking the view, obviously, the Catholic, Orthodox and Protestant, they sort of all have that leaven in them, they all have that sin. And I think the main error that we see in all those churches is that rejection of Israel. And I think that's what Jesus is trying to get across here, that in the mystery of the kingdom, when we see later, we're going to actually get into that error. So I wouldn't call myself a Protestant, actually. I'd refer to myself as a Christian. But we are part of that remnant that is left, that tiny, tiny percentage of like true believers that take all of the Bible as it is written. On a slightly different note, it's really interesting because if you go different translations, if you just use the NIV, so the New International Version, you wouldn't have the term free in there. It's really interesting. Free talks about free measures. So yeah, free measures of meal. You'd have the term £50, which is really interesting because that's the way it was all divided. And for me, I think that changes the entire meaning of that. That will change it because I think given the context of Matthew, I think it's quite clear, or I believe it's clear that it's talking about that it is the topic I'm talking about. But then the Greek word there is tria, that means free. So I think they should keep the word free in there, really. The New King James, or the King James and the ESV keep the word free. And like I say, if you change that, it changes the whole meaning, which I find quite fascinating. But I just want to give some examples because it may be interesting. You may be sort of sat there thinking, well, surely the Protestant church are fine. Well, obviously the Catholic and Orthodox are supersessionist. And I think the idea, getting across, because obviously in this context we are talking about, there are many bits that go on to talk about Israel. So I think the parable of the pearl, I believe, gets into about Israel, and I think the parable of the dragnet as well gets into the idea of Israel. I believe this one is as well, and I think it is as such that it's talking about those free churches that are filled with that sin, that are filled with that leaven, and it is because of their rejection of Israel and the anti-Semitism that stems from those groups. I'll provide a few examples as we finish. Examples, you've got Justin Martyr, so in his dialogue with Trypho, published in 150, he made a strong case for the new Israel and the true Israel in a replacement of biblical Israel, and he basically formed the term replacement theology. And he is venerated, so Justin is venerated in Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, and Lutheran as a saint, with Anglican and Lutheran obviously being Protestants, some of the early Protestant movements. Augustine of Hippo, he's venerated by the Catholic and Reformed Church. Again, he was an open supersessionist, believed that God was done with Israel. He's amillennialist, so he believes the millennium won't happen. He basically believes that was in our hearts as such, as Christians, and that those prophecies for Israel were going to be for believers later. You hold the Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Reformed, and Methodist all hold to covenant theology, which rejects the prophecies for Israel. Again, and obviously they are into replacement. And probably one of the biggest ones is Martin Luther himself. Obviously, he started the Reformation. At various parts of his life, he's been an open anti-Semite. Paragraphed from his On the Jews and Their Lives and Their Lies. He deplores Christendom's failure to expel them from Christian countries, wanted them gone, described them as vermin, things like that. So I really hope it's clear sort of what I've laid out there about obviously Matthew. It talks about, just to summarise, the switching over. Jesus gives the Jews one last chance. He then gets into Matthew 13, talking about the age in which we are in now, that mystery of the kingdom of heaven, and what exactly the church life will be like, what it is like for the church. So that parable there makes a lot more sense when you look at it in terms of like, what is our church going to look like? It's going to look like, well, kingdom of heaven is like leaven. So that area of church, is going to be filled with sin. It's going to be filled with wickedness, which the woman, so obviously that idolatry, took and hid 3 measures of meals, so split into 3 parts. It was all leaven. And what we understand as Christendom, with the Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestants, those 3 parts are littered with that. One of their biggest things being the rejection of God's chosen people, which is Israel. So, I don't know if there's any questions or thoughts.